Hello my friends, welcome to another video. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we are going to paint together these bright orange flowers, and in particular we are going to learn how to build all of these layers on the leaves and on the petals in order to give good dimensions and a nice style. Let's start. In order to create these flowers, I started to create the first layer of paint by mixing a little bit of yellow ochre and a little bit of orange Winsor. I add a little bit of yellow lemon dip on my color palette, and with a light value of this color, using the belly and the side of my brush, I just started to create a general shape of this flower. This flower has petals all around the center, and I'm going to create all of these petals with this very light value of this yellow color that I've created on my color palette. Then, while this first layer of paint is still wet, I started to add a few brush strokes of more concentrated color from my palette. I am being very loose and I do not think too much where to add these brush strokes of more concentrated yellow, and as I'm doing now, a little bit of more concentrated orange, Winsor orange. I just want to have this wet on wet technique where these brush strokes I'm adding in this moment are going to blend very nicely with the underneath layer of yellow paint that is still wet. I let these colors, and now I'm adding a little bit of Scarlet Lake, blend with each other, and I just keep in mind to be loose, and I try just to have fun while adding these different brush strokes one on top of the other. In this tutorial, we are learning how to create and to build layers. So the first layer is just a very loose approximation of what the flower overall looks like. And I proceed usually creating all different layers of all the flowers that I want to have on the composition. And then I usually add layers on top when I have an overall understanding of what I have created. So for now, I keep adding through the wet on wet technique on the second flower additional brush strokes of Winsor orange and concentrated Scarlet Lake. And with the belly and the side of my brush, I allow these different layers to blend with one another. As a general rule, what I would like to recommend you is to use the wet on wet technique, as we are doing now, to add dimension to these first petals and to this overall shape of the flowers we are creating. And then my recommendation is to add additional layers, for example a second layer or eventually even a third layer, when the layers underneath are completely dry. I proceed creating another flower with similar colors to the first two that I've already created, and as I have already done for the other two flowers, I'm creating just a general shape with a very light value of orange color that is obtained by mixing Winsor orange and a little bit of yellow ochre and yellow lemon dip, having on the brush a very light amount of pigment and a bigger amount of water. I'm creating this third flower with a different shape compared to the first two I've created. The first two were created using especially the belly of my brush and creating this quite general round shape, while this third flower is created more having in mind a sort of a peony and using mainly the side of the brush to create these petals. In this moment, I'm adding a few brush strokes of yellow lemon dip, and I'm letting this yellow blend with the underneath orange layer that I've created for the petals of this flower. So this tutorial is not only an exercise to understand how to create different layers on petals and leaves, but also how to create different types of flowers still in loose style and not too complicated. Also, if you are a beginner and you want to learn how to create as many types of flowers as possible, I have completed a 20-day flower creation journey. You can find on this channel the playlist, the 20-day flower creation journey, where you can learn how to create in very loose style 20 different flowers. You can check it out. I leave here the link to this playlist. As I have created orange flowers in the center, I started to add a few blue buds in very loose style, just to give a nice touch of color. Blue and orange are opposite colors on the color wheel. They are complementary colors and therefore they fit very well when they are sitting next to each other in a floral composition. They enhance each other, and therefore I recommend you, if you are using, for example, orange as a main color for your composition, to add a few touches of blue here and there. To create these loose style flowers, I'm just using mainly the belly of my filbert brush and the side of the brush. I am filling the spaces, the white spaces on the page, remembering to change the color value and the color hue of this blue. Sometimes I use a little bit of Prussian Blue, sometimes I mix it with a little bit of Cobalt Blue, and I remember to remove part of the pigment in the cup of water in order to create different color values. And so I add these flowers until I'm satisfied with the overall composition so far. At this point, I take a round brush in size 6 and a little bit of green, a mixture of green that I already have on my palette. Most likely it's a little bit of Sap Green and a little bit of magenta and darker colors, maybe some blue. And with the tip of my brush and with the belly of my brush, I start to create some stems that connect these blue flowers to the center of the composition. To create the stems of these flowers, I just use the very tip of the brush and not so much pressure. When I started to create these loose style leaves, I instead add a little bit of more pressure from the belly of the brush until the tip of the brush touches the paper. I remember to change the color hue, so I add in this case a little bit of yellow to the mixture of green, and I keep filling the white spaces with leaves. I imagine these blue loose style flowers all coming down the center of this composition, and therefore all of their stems are leading to the same center. At this point, with the brush in size 12, this is still a round brush, I started to create loose style leaves but bigger in size. And I've decided to use a brighter sort of green. This is mainly Sap Green. And with the belly and the tip of this round brush, I started to let my brush dance around the paper and create these leaves. When creating leaves, I use the same approach as for petals of the flowers. This means that I usually create a first layer of leaves with different color values and color hues, and then when the leaves are going to be completely dry, I start to add more definition and additional strokes on top. Basically, I am adding layers on leaves too. I also remember to add on the leaves, while these are still wet, a few brush strokes of different colors that will blend through the wet on wet technique. In this case, I'm creating a mixture of sap green with a little bit of orange, because orange is the main color that I've used for the flowers. And therefore, creating this sort of green that is a little bit more muted and towards the orange color will remove the gap between the bright color of the sap green and the orange color of the flowers. At this point, I've created a first layer for the main flowers, the secondary flowers in blue colors, and the leaves. So now, using the same brush in size 12, this is a round brush, I mix a little bit of orange, a little bit of Scarlet Lake, and some magenta. And with a very light mixture, I start to use the belly and the side of this round brush to create the second layer into the petals. So basically, I start to add layers when the first layer, the layer underneath, is completely dry. I usually start to add and build on layers with darker color values of similar colors that I've used for the first layer of the petals. So in this case, I'm using still a mixture of orange, a little bit of red, and a little bit of yellow lemon dip. And with different percentages of these colors, I started to create these layers, sometimes using just the tip of the brush to create very fine lines, and sometimes the belly of the brush to create some areas that are bigger in size, and I add then a few brush strokes on top with some concentrated, in this case red, through the wet on wet technique that are going to blend with the second layer I've just created. My recommendation for you at this point is to play with shapes, play with the colors of your palette, and don't be afraid to try things you have never tried before. For example, don't be afraid to mix colors that you haven't used for your first layering of the petals, and just experiment. Create different brush strokes of different dimensions, sometimes thicker and sometimes thinner in shape. You can look at a reference picture if you want to understand better where to add these darker areas, but you can also just play with your imagination and with what you have created, and you can just try to add these brush strokes where it best fits your imagination. My recommendation for you is to remember that as you have done on the first layer, you can add also on the second layer through the wet on wet technique different blending effects while the second layer is still wet. Usually I like to create a second layer following the shape of the petals that I've created underneath. So this is a sort of guidance that I follow when I create these layers, when I'm building layers on top of the first one. Depending on the size of the flowers that I've created, and depending also on the effect that I want to achieve, the final effect, I sometimes use a round brush in size 12 to add layers. Sometimes instead I just use a smaller brush, for example a round brush in size 6, to add these brush strokes to highlight some of the petals. Adding layers is a great moment to have fun and to learn by doing how to add volume and movement to your flowers. Usually it takes a little bit of practice and it takes some time to achieve some results that you might like, but I encourage you not to give up and to keep practicing to achieve results that I am sure you will love. What I also like to do is with the very thin tip of this brush to highlight part of the petals, just creating a few brush strokes that delineate the shape of the petals. So this is what I am doing in this moment with a concentrated amount of orange and red Scarlet Lake. You can add more concentrated brush strokes and very short brush strokes in the center of your open flowers, and these will give the impression that these flowers have some shadows in the middle of their shape. With a smaller brush in size 6, this is still a round brush, I started to mix a dark green. This is a different color hue of green, so I'm mixing a little bit of Sap Green with a little bit of Prussian Blue. And with this mixture, I'm adding a few layers on top of the leaves that I've created in the first layer. I'm using a smaller brush because this will give me the possibility to create some brush strokes that are different from the ones I've created with a thicker brush. Using just the tip of this brush or the belly of this brush and changing the pressure that I use onto paper, I create different brush strokes that give the impression that these leaves have different shadows. And then, mixing a little bit of Cobalt Blue with Magenta, I created this dark purple, and I started to add a few brush strokes with this brush on the blue petals of these loose flowers I've created with the first layer. I suggest you to look at the composition in the way you have created and just add these brush strokes where it feels nice, in your opinion, to add these darker brush strokes. There isn't a rule where these brush strokes need to be positioned on each and every painting, so just try and have fun and add these brush strokes all over the page. With a mixture of yellow ochre and the same round brush, I create some very fine dots in the center of the flowers to create the center of these flowers. I also mix a little bit of burnt umber, and I allow the burnt umber to blend completely with the yellow ochre that is still wet on the flower, and this mixture will give a little bit of dimension to the center of these flowers. And then I proceed in the same way to create the center of the other two flowers. In particular, for the flower on the left side, I created the center by touching the paper with the very tip of this brush and then creating very fine vertical strokes. And at this point, we are reaching the end of this tutorial. I hope you had a better understanding on how to create layers. I hope to see you in the next video.